بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد بن عبد الله أفضل صلاة وتسليم. الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. الحمد لله الحمد لله الحمد لله. Bismillah. Welcome everyone to session 3 of Lessons from the Cave. Inshallah, this week I'll be finishing the second part of the Companions of the Cave. As I did last week, inshallah, I'm going to share my screen presentation and we'll go from there, inshallah. Let me maximize that. There we are. Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First, I just like to make an update, an announcement. One thing is I might be consulting my phone from time to time just to look at the questions that are popping up, because I'm not able to do that directly on the screen. And the second thing is because I underestimated the amount of time it would take me to finish the stories, you may have noticed that I've eliminated the story of the parable of the two men and the gardens. I won't dedicate a whole session to it. What I'll do is in the last session on Dhul Qarnayn, when I wrap up in the last 15 minutes, I'll come back to the topic of the two men in the garden, because I think it's really, really crucial and very, very important. And it delivers a number of crucial insights to the nature of the surah, inshallah. As usual, I'm going to start with a few questions from the previous lesson. Just a note, this session will be longer than usual. I'm expecting it to be around an hour and a half. Just a heads up for those of you who need to leave early. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So one of the questions that came up last week, and I only noticed after I had closed the session, is this one. Can you comment on the verse where God says, so that we may know in relation to the notion of divine omniscience? So the verse is verse 12 of Surah Al-Kahf. ثم بعثناهم لنعلم أي الحزبين أحصى لما لبثوا أمدا. And the question is in regards to, well, why does the actual verse say, so that we may know, in reference to the divine? If God already knows, if God is already the all-knowing, why would he have to do that? And many of the commentators attribute it to a linguistic, rhetorical device in many ways. And what it suggests is not so much that God needs to do this to find out what's going to happen, but rather he wants to resurrect them so that he may show them, as it were. But the phraseology or the phrasing of it as لِنَعْلَمَ أَيُّ الْحِزْبَيْنِ gives it a stronger sense of, it's like saying in English, if you know someone's going to fail an exam, they haven't studied at all, and they have no capacity to pass the exam at all. You say, I'm going to give them an exam, and I'm going to find out what they're capable of. It's almost rhetorical. You know they're going to fail the exam. But it's a stronger expression of the fact that you already know what's about to happen, but you want to show them, i.e. the student, that they will fail, right? And so it's very similar here in this sense that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not saying that he wants to know, but as it were, we'll see and show them, i.e. al-Hizbayn, the ones who were arguing, which one was correct. And it turns out that obviously in the grand scheme of things they're all incorrect, and only God knows. The second question was, is the surah addressed about the Trinity, and is it about Christians? At the very beginning of the surah we have a point. Whoever asked this question, thank you for that, because the fourth verse of the surah says وَيُنْزِلَ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا اتَّخَذَ اللَّهُ وَلَدًا, that the surah was revealed partly in order to respond to those who claim that God has a son or a child. And some scholars suggest that it refers to the Trinity. Other scholars actually suggest it refers to the Quraysh, who claimed that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had daughters. At the time in which this was revealed, it was a major contention among Quraysh. The Prophet ﷺ had confronted them about this issue. And they kept on insisting that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has daughters. And of course, the Christians had insisted on the fact that God has a child or a son. So in a sense, it's not so much specifically targeted at Christians per se, but it is targeted at the idea of shirk in general. You'll see that the overall theme of the whole chapter it deals with this issue of shirk. And so as not to specify the verse too much, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala left its subtle references out. So yes, it refers to the Christians. Yes, it refers to Quraysh. And yes, it refers to anyone who may suggest that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a sharik or a walad. And the third question was about psychedelics and drugs. And I think this one requires a little bit more attention. So I'm going to dedicate a whole slide to this one. In part because I think it's a question that comes up again and again among many youth today who are may be familiar with a lot of the literature on trance states and alternate states of reality or experiences, and may have perhaps become wrongly convinced that indeed spiritual states can be induced by injecting drugs or by other arbitrary and artificial means. So I'm going to address this in the following way. First of all, there's a whole body of literature in the Islamic tradition I would call the genre of la yu'awwal alayh. And that tradition means, the literal meaning of this expression means that you cannot rely on it, or it's unreliable, or it's not real, as it were, or it's not something you can depend on, right? And what is it referring to? Let me explain. So I'm going to draw or help visualize a rough sketch or diagram of the human being. A human being, of course, consists of, let's say, a physical, somatic, or bodily sphere, a psychological sphere, as it were, and a spiritual sphere. Now, there's many other aspects of the human being, but I want to draw attention to these specific three categories or spheres in regards to addressing the question on psychedelics and drugs. Now, in the Islamic tradition, it makes a very clear distinction, or it develops very strict criteria on how to distinguish between authentic spiritual experiences and pseudo experiences that may seem like they're real spiritual experiences. And those are the kind of experiences we say la yu'awwal alayha, that you can't really rely on them, that they mimic or they simulate something higher, but they're not really higher. And the Islamic tradition developed very strict criteria or for how to distinguish between them. I'm not going to get into a lot of those right now because this is not the place for it. But I want to summarize and address only four particular points. The first thing I want to say is the spiritual sphere in a strict traditional Islamic cosmology and metaphysics refers to a realm of reality that exists, and that it is real, and it exists at a very high ontological level of reality. Today, when we say I had a spiritual experience, like I saw the sunset and I had a spiritual experience, that doesn't really refer to a spiritual experience, i.e. an experience of the spirit, ar-ruh, which is the highest aspect of ourself, or the highest aspect of our reality. Ruh is of God, it is from God, He breathes it into us. So it has an authentic reality to it that is the highest reality possible. And when we say that I have attained to a spiritual experience, it literally means that I have ascended to a highest possible level of experience as a human being, the realm of the spirit, which is very close or high above in the hierarchy of existence. It doesn't, and so today when we use the word quite loosely and arbitrarily, we have really butchered the term, and it has to do with the chaos and terms and confusions in terms and vocabulary that we use today. The spiritual has been emptied of any substance to it, and refers to any wishy-washy tree-hugging kind of experience that one may have. A sunset, for example. I've heard people say they, at a rock concert, they've had a spiritual experience. Now, I understand what that expression means. It means they have an out-of-body experience, or they've had a profound experience. But if we want to remain very faithful to precise use of terminology, it is not spiritual in the sense that it is not of the spirit. I mean, it's not, its source is not a ruh that is within us, nor the spiritual sphere. The traces of a genuine spiritual experience, because in Islamic tradition, a genuine, authentic spiritual experience has alamat, or traces, athar. The traces of genuine spiritual experiences, one, for example, it leads to an improved outward adherence to the Sharia and an overall improved moral behavior and adab. So someone who ascends, or someone who has authentic spiritual experiences, that experience leaves in them certain kind of traces or effects. And one of the effects is that they have a deep and profound appreciation for the wisdom of the Sharia, and they adhere to it even closer than normal. It improves their moral, ethical behavior. It improves their adab, their spiritual etiquette and mannerisms with other human beings, with themselves, with nature, with animals, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with everything. The second trace or effect of a true, genuine spiritual experience is that it leaves within you certain kind of spiritual states, ahwal, that ultimately lead to spiritual stations, maqam. And these are unique gifts in that they are existential states or modes of being that, once you have them, remain with you to a certain extent. And it often leaves genuine spiritual experiences usually lead to higher levels of consciousness, or higher levels of understanding, or higher level of ru'ya, basira. And they also lead to true visions, ru'ya haq. And these are some among many of the traces of a genuine spiritual experience. Now, it'll be clarified more when I contrast it with the other kinds of experiences. So, for example, when we talk about psychedelic drugs, note here that the realm of operation of psychedelic drugs is the psychosomatic, the bodily, and perhaps the psychological sphere. And so psychedelic drugs operate to generate or project somatic or psychosomatic experiences, so psychological or bodily and psychological experiences. And it is understandable why someone who has a profound psychological experience can confuse it with something higher. As one great scholar once said, it's sometimes difficult to distinguish between the warmth of a light from above and the warmth of hell from below, meaning that someone who hasn't had a very high spiritual experience from alam al-ruh, if one's only experience or out-of-body experience or profound experience in this world has been a psychological one, it's understandable how they can confuse it with something higher. Let me give you an example. Someone might go to a rock concert or a musical concert, or be with a gathering of people and feel some kind of oneness with the crowd. And these are things that a lot of people talk about. Or one may take a drug and feel that they're entering into modes of thinking and feeling that they've never had access to before. And that's a genuine kind of experience, except that, as I'll explain in a minute, there's no telling where they're coming from, except by their traces. But most likely, these experiences are generated from the psychological sphere. So sometimes when we have an inrush of an experience within our psychic realm, it feels like it's overwhelming, and it possesses us, or it feels like we're out of our body. And that is true. But a purely psychic experience can do that. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a spiritual experience. And when we're talking about Ahl al-Kahf and the awliya, and when we're talking about suluk Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're talking about actualizing spiritual experiences of the highest order. That is why psychedelic drugs, although they can generate profound bodily and psychological and bodily experiences, they cannot generate spiritual experiences, because the spiritual experience comes from above. From above. It doesn't come from below. So if the human realm is here, the human realm is all this. These psychedelics that are induced or injected into the body and induce experiences come from below. Right? They're like a balloon that bubbles up and grows. Spiritual experiences, by definition, come to you from a higher realm. And so when we look at psychosomatic experiences, for example, the traces of psychosomatic experiences can be one trace or one criteria is that they're usually temporary and often confused for a spiritual high, that they're addictive and require renewed highs because the previous one never lasts. I'll give you an example. I've often, I used to go with a friend to Mozart concerts, and my friend used to tell me that there were these famous classical concerts in Cambridge that happened all the time, but she would go every week, and she felt like she would often describe it as a profound spiritual experience. And upon interrogating her, I realized that they were very profound psychological experiences, but not so much spiritual, because the spiritual experience elevates you and leaves you on a higher plateau. It's like climbing a mountain. A spiritual experience takes you to a higher altitude and leaves you there. And then the next spiritual experience or high takes you up to another level and to another level. So it's a perpetual mi'raj, perpetual ascent. Whereas a psychological experience or a psychological high, it gives you a peak, and then it goes back down to where it was before, or even lower. And then it peaks like this and it goes back down, which is why it's addictive, which is why you need it all the time, because it doesn't leave you in a better place afterwards, after a while. It gets you to this high, and then it dissolves or fades away by the end of the week, and then you need it again next week. And so one of the criteria or one of the traces of a psychosomatic high is that you need to do it again and again and again, because it gives you a higher than it recedes, Whereas a spiritual experience always places you at a higher level. One might say spiritual experiences are also addictive, but they're addictive because you want to aspire to higher and higher and higher and higher levels, not because it gives you a high and then leaves you, abandons you, and then you have to get it again and get up and down, up and down. Also, psychosomatic experiences rarely give you a higher level of consciousness, although while you're having the experience, you may think you have a high level of consciousness. It doesn't necessarily entail that. And usually psychosomatic experiences or highs are rarely or don't necessarily lead to greater moral ethical behavior or adab or adherence to the shara. Whereas a spiritual experience always leaves you with a trace of knowledge in your heart. And genuine spiritual experiences, because they're coming from a level of reality that is more real than our physical reality, they feel more real than anything in this world. There's a haqq about it, there's a yaqeen about it that you can't get from psychosomatic highs that mimic spiritual highs. And unfortunately, the only way to really distinguish between them is if you've had the higher one and you've had the lower one, you can really compare them. People who have only experienced psychosomatic highs find it very difficult to accept a criticism of their experience as not being from a spiritual realm, because it seems to be a denial of the meaningful nature of their experience, which isn't necessarily the case. So I'm going to leave it at that, inshallah. Maybe at some point later we can elaborate a little bit more. I wanted to touch on this because I think it's very important. The experiences that Ahl al-Kahf were going through and real, genuine spiritual experiences are not things that can be ever induced or mimicked by psychedelic drugs. Okay, let's leave that point. So, the companions of the cave, part 2, inshallah. Let me just make sure everything is running smoothly. Okay, okay, excellent. So I'm going to continue and pick up from where I left last time. Scene 1, as I call it, verses 13 to 16, the two paths. So in the Quran, we read, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in Surah Al-Kahf. We continue from last time. Last time I said that the first few verses, 4 verses, were a summary of the whole story, and now a bit more detail is going to unfold. So, نحن نقص عليك نبأهم بالحق إنهم فتية آمنوا بربهم وزدناهم هدى. So, I want to reiterate the importance of the notion of haqq here. نحن نقص عليك نبأهم بالحق. And I'll repeat a slide that I did last week. Because it came up in a conversation in the past week with a friend, we're obsessed with this notion of objectivity, objective reality. And this friend of mine was saying that the only true measure of what it means to be a rational human being is to pursue the truth, to pursue this objectivity. But can we really ever reach it on our own? If we don't have a scope, if our scope and horizon doesn't cover all of reality, can we really do it justice? Can we really achieve that degree of objectivity, especially using the very impoverished and narrow tools of pure reason and logic? The pursuit of what is objective is real, and real is commendable, but we must seek it in the right place. And so what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about reality is the most accurate mirror or most accurate representation of how reality actually is. The divine author is the one who is telling us. So the only objectivity really is divine objectivity, and the only objective reality is the divine reality and truth. And so what we should expect to discover in the story is that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is about to tell us is the reality of the story. And what that means is that He's not necessarily going to tell us how the historical events or the material events happened to the external eye, because one can say, when you observe an event unfolding before your eyes, you're looking at a frame or perspective on those events. You can't possibly gaze into the hearts of the people. You can't possibly take into account the million possible factors and conditions that led these two individuals to this particular moment in which they engage with each other in a particular way. We can't also see the causal effects that come from alam al-ghayb, what we call the vertical causality. We often talk about horizontal causality. This event A led to event B, this led to this. I saw this person do this, and then he hit this person, and this person reacted in this way. These are a chain of causal events that only describe the materialistic aspect of the event. But events unfold within a complex matrix of time, space, and alam al-ghayb. And so it's difficult to really give an accurate representation of what's actually going on unless we're actually able to see how the events are entangled with other factors and elements that are beyond our physical perception. And so what we expect then is that the divine will not reveal necessarily events to us in their linear unfolding, because if you think about it, some of the scholars in the tafsir tradition say the people of Quraysh who sent a delegation to Medina or Yathrib at the time to ask the Jewish scholars to give them 3 difficult questions to pose to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they asked 3 different questions, and you think, well, why would answering these questions be proof that he's a prophet? The Qur'an itself at the time, and the prophetic character of the Prophet ﷺ, and all the other remarkable events surrounding his life were enough proof to anyone who had an iota of common sense that he was a prophet. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not need to stoop to their level and answer their insignificant and sometimes maybe pernicious question trying to embarrass the Prophet ﷺ. And so when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does reply and respond, he's not necessarily answering directly their question. Although scholars do say that these were revealed as a response, they don't say these stories answer their questions. The questions were the occasion for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealing these stories. But the stories themselves do not necessarily respond to, they're not beholden to the demands of Quraysh or the Jewish scholars. And so we should not expect that the story, because the historical event was known to many people at the time. But what you notice is that the Quran doesn't narrate a historical event. It's doing something very, very different. And as we go through the surah, you'll see that it's really unraveling something else entirely. And so the Quran demands that we listen to what it unfolds before us, not to expect and find something, or impose on it our own cognitive structures and assumptions. The Quran didn't respond and say, I'm going to tell you the story that you're expecting to hear, oh, Jewish rabbis in Yathrib. No, it doesn't do that at all. And it doesn't narrate events to us in ways that we often expect them to unfold. But what it is doing is it is narrating to us events in their complex reality. And hopefully I'll point out a few of those as we go along, inshallah. So let's go back to this notion of al-haq. The Quranic view then does not assume that we are somehow just conscious, rational creatures in control of things. That's an illusion. It assumes that we partake of a reality where we have choices, but that we are also affected by factors we cannot possibly account for, factors from the unseen. And so what the Quranic narrative is doing is showing you or unraveling threads from the unseen that had an influence on the unfolding of events. So if the Jewish rabbis were to ask Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, tell us the story, they'd probably expect that the story unfold precisely in the way that they heard it from their ancestors, who heard it from the people who witnessed the event. But the events as told by the people over the generations is a description of, these individuals who fled a king, went to a cave, and somehow woke up 300 years later. That's not what the Quran is about to tell, because there are so many different factors. Let me just check these questions. Okay, there are so many different factors that go into the event. And so remember, I put up this image last time, which is an image of our neurological neurosystem. And the reason why I put up this image is to show you that even within us, even within our existence, our bodies, our mind, we have a complex network of connections. So if in our mind, our brain is so intricately connected in ways that cannot be reduced to a single thread, can you imagine how complex reality is there? Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by narrating the story to us, is taking a number of these three-dimensional threads and showing them to us. There are different actors, as we'll see. There's Allah, who inspires. There's the Ahl-Kahf, who communicate to Allah. There's the king who persecutes them. There is each other in the cave. There's a number of different factors that go back and forth between the seen and the unseen, or the seen and the seen. Alam al-shahada, alam al-shahada, or alam al-shahada, alam al-ghayb. And therefore, what the Quran teaches us then is, or what the Quran reveals as a text, are these complex threads that are a more accurate, objective representation of the nature of things. And so what we are expected to do is to align ourselves with the Quran. If we ignore it, we align ourselves with an illusion, i.e. we align ourselves with what we, or how we construct the nature of events or the nature of reality. And that's the arrogance of the modern, rational, materialistic mind. So in the second verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَرَبَطْنَا عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ. So in the previous verse, نَحْنُ نَقُصُّ عَلَيْكَ نَبَأَهُمْ بِالْحَقِّ إِنَّهُمْ فِتْيَةٌ. We already commented on the meaning of fitya. آمَنُوا بِرَبِّهِمْ. They believed in their Lord. Therefore, we وَزِدْنَاهُمْ هُدًى. We increased in them guidance. And then, وَرَبَطْنَا عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ. So this is an interesting expression, and we made firm their hearts. And that means, but what's interesting about this expression is it raises a number of questions. As you can see, many of the commentators trying to unravel this. Did God make their hearts firm? And then they stood up. So وَرَبَطْنَا عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ إِذْ قَامُوا. So we made their hearts firm and then they stood up. Did God make their hearts firm first and then they stood up? Or did they stand up and in response God made their heart firm? Or is it both? I found this in a wonderful commentary, and it says they stood up for God and by God. So it's a kind of a simultaneous thing. Ultimately, we can't really do anything without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His irada and His mashia, His will and His irada for us to do so. And so ultimately, although we have a choice to acquire the ability to act in certain ways, ultimately, in reality, we are also carried forth in life by threads from the unseen that all connect back to ultimately to God. They stood up for God and by God. Whoso stands up by God is lost to others. Whoso is strengthened to stand up by God is oblivious, is lost to others, present to Allah and absent to others. Whoso stands up for God does not sit until he or she reaches God. And this is a really remarkable testament to the faith, the amount of faith that they have in their heart. And it says, وَرَبَطْنَا عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ is a very brilliant, beautiful expression, because it's almost like we tied and made firm their heart, their hearts, قُلُوبِهِمْ, because that's the faculty within us that actually grants this kind of access to Allah and the unseen. إِذْ قَامُوا, they stood up. This refers to the fact that they stood up firm in their faith, in the face of the world and its temptations. It also refers to the fact that they, in some of the commentaries, they refer to the historical incident in which they were actually interrogated by the king about their beliefs. And so God made their heart firm so that they may stand up and not waver. They proclaimed their faith and spoke truth to power. What they said, we will show a little bit later, we'll see. They said, but the saying is a saying that they did with profound faith, as I said. The Prophet ﷺ defined the word iman, as I showed you in the first presentation, as a knowledge in the heart, voicing with the tongue, and activity with the limbs, which suggests that their iman, they are fitya, youth who believed in their Lord. It's not something that they just voiced with their tongue, but it's something that they had deeply and profoundly within their heart as a yaqeen, and something that they actually live by. A lot of us, unfortunately, voice our iman with our tongue, have a partial knowledge of it in our heart, but fail to actualize it with our limbs. And actualizing it with our limbs is very crucial, as I explained before, that this movement of faith has to cover all these three domains of the heart, the tongue, and the limbs. What did they say? They said, فَقَالُوا رَبُّنَا رَبُّ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ لَن نَدْعُوَ مِن دُونِهِ إِلَهًا لَقَدْ قُلْنَا إِذًا شَطَطًا. They comment on this, our Lord is that they all of a sudden now the Quranic story shifts again, and we are almost actively involved. We project ourselves into the situation of the story as if we have been reading it correctly, because they said, قالوا, and this is a very famous dua in the Quran, رَبَّنَا أو رَبُّنَا رَبُّ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. And so we are the ones almost standing before the king, or the arrogant and the proud ones. We are the ones standing before the world and saying, our Lord is the Lord of the heavens and the earth. We shall not call upon any God or deity other than Him. And this shift between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describing what's happening, and then the fitya speaking, but in the first person, and sometimes in the second and third person. This constant shift between the first, second, and third person represents a remarkable shift of perspectives, where we feel often that we are either intimately involved, actively carrying out the act itself, if we are reading it with khushu', and often standing back when the divine clap of thunder intervenes to assert its authority and power, as we saw earlier in previous verses last week. But what did they say? They said that our Lord is the Lord of the heavens and the earth. We shall not call upon any deity other than him. Now here, deity may refer to literally another god or deity, but it is important to point out at this particular juncture that in the Qur'an, it does say in several other places that that there is a possibility that sometimes we may take our own desires as our deities. And it's a very profound psycho-spiritual observation here, and which is that within our psyche, within our being, there has to be a center around which everything revolves. And if it is not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at that center, it will have to be filled, that void will be filled by a different ultimate concern. In our materialistic age that we live in today, the ultimate concern is materialistic. It's money, it's consumption, it's the mode of being, of having, consuming, being seen to consume. And they're fundamentally problematic. And so what the verse is alluding to, and what the barakah and the karama of these remarkable youth is such that not only did they empty their hearts of the possibility of any other deity, but they also hollowed out their hearts of any other ultimate concern other than God. There's two things happening here, and it's a very, very profound thing to understand and know. And so by specifying, and this is expressed in the actual dua, by specifying that their Lord is the Lord of the heavens and the earth, they are making the supreme statement of faith, really. The only reality around which their whole being revolves is the one, al-ahad. It's a statement of ikhlas. Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad. It's called the chapter of Tawhid, chapter of ikhlas. It has two names because it's the ultimate testimony of our ikhlas and sincerity to Allah. That not only do we not call upon any other god or deity, but no other thing takes the center within our being, within our psyche, within our life, except the reality of the one. And let's continue. هؤلاء قومنا اتخذوا من دونه آلهة لولا يأتون عليهم بسلطان بين فمن أظلم ممن افترى على الله كذبا. It's a very, very remarkable verse indeed. The whole Quran is remarkable, but it alludes to something that in the Islamic tradition is referred to as dalil at-tamanu. It's the proof that there can't be more than one God. And so the proof is quite straightforward. It goes something like this. I'm going to read that for you. If there was more than one God, there would be chaos rather than order in the universe. Since there is order in the universe, there must be only one God. Tamanu means that there can't be, or there can't be, or impossibility of being there being another. And so the argument itself is referred to in the Quran in several verses, which I'm not going to read here, but very quickly, the last one is, if there were, as they assert, deities apart from him, surely they would seek a way to the master of the supreme throne. And the idea here is really summarized in the following argument. If there is more than one God, these gods will not always agree with one another. They will most likely try to have things in the universe happen their own way. One of them may want for a stone to move, for example, while the other may want for it to remain motionless. Having both actions happen at the same time is impossible. If two gods are equal in power, they would be locked in a tie forever, never being able to win over the other, and so nothing would get done in the universe. But we know from what we see that things are always happening and the universe is in order, and so therefore there can only be one God. If, however, one of the gods overcomes the other, one of them will be powerless. A powerless God is not really a God, and therefore we can only have one God. Okay? It's a very elegant argument that the Quran brings forth again and again. But the point of bringing it up again and again is because to illustrate that the belief in more than one God, or the belief in the fact that God has associates, is not founded, this is the key term here, not founded on any solid authority or foundation. Let's explore that a little bit more. It's a form of shirk. It's a form of shirk But even more so, it's a form of shirk that has no proof whatsoever. One of the most amazing things about Tawhid, and this is the advantage a lot of Muslims have over many other religious traditions, is that it's the easiest, the clearest, most intuitive fact that one can articulate and defend so easily. It doesn't take a lot of effort and energy because it is more real than any other fact. It has so much evidence for it. It has, and I'm talking about rational evidence, it has so much intuitive evidence, it has so much truth of it in the heart that, and it is the norm in most cultures and religious traditions. And I'll come back to the point a little bit later, but the idea is that even in the most idolatrous religious traditions around the world, they've always had a notion of the supreme one God above all the other gods. Okay? So it's the easiest thing to really articulate and defend. Shirk is the most difficult thing to prove. And in the Quran, if you read this, what I call an anatomy of shirk and idolatry in the Quran, it reduces the causes of shirk and unbelief to four causes, or four reasons, or four causes. Al-kibr, which is pride, deviation, inhiraf, injustice, zulm, and ignorance, jahl. And you'll notice that none of these are actual rational, logical foundations. The causes for shirk are not sound causes. They're all false premises. Shirk departs from pride, deviation, injustice, ignorance. We're not going to get into a detailed exposition of all these, but what I do want to illustrate is that because it can't be founded on any solid authority and foundation, therefore, inevitably, it is فَمَنْ أَظْلَمُ مِمَّنْ افْتَرَى عَلَى اللَّهِ كَذِبًا. It is a form of lying. It's something that one can only uphold by distorting the facts. And note, the word أَظْلَمُ means injustice. In the translation it says, and who is more unjust than the one who invents about Allah a lie? But also أَظْلَمُ in Arabic can also mean darker. So he who is darker or is in darkness, who is in darkness more than the one who brings a lie upon God? That person must be in a darkness of ignorance, zulum, injustice, and notice zulum also means darkness, deviation, and kibr. It is an illusion to think that shirk is real. It's not real. It isn't. It has no foundation at all in reality. No proof that it is. When confronted with the challenge of providing incontrovertible proof for it, it often fails. In addition, the expression suggests that they have never really thought it through. They have no authority for such a belief other than the four causes of shirk that I mentioned earlier. So the injustice and the darkness here alluded to is twofold. It is an injustice to God because he deserves more from us. But of course, our injustice against him amounts to nothing because we can't really harm or bring any other to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is fundamentally also an injustice against ourselves. And that is partly explained by the verb, the first verb in the verse, which I want to comment on now. اتخذوا هؤلاء قوم اتخذوا. In the English translation, it says, these are people have taken besides him deities. And I like the translation taken because taken conveys similar connotations to the word اتخذوا or أخذوا in Arabic. The root اتخذوا suggests in this context that you have taken possession of. And so what that means is, and I'm engaging in a bit of a linguistic stretch here, but that it draws out the essence of idolatry, which is a taking possession of. An idol is a thing what we ourselves make and we project. We project our own powers into it, we project our own desires, we project our own pride into it. Thus committing a grave injustice against ourselves in the process. We then submit to it without any sultan and bayyin, without any solid foundation, because it is nothing but the hot air that we have projected ourselves. And paradoxically, by submitting to it, something else happens. We presume that we are in touch indeed with God or the gods or the higher power. And recall here Ibrahim alayhi salam's argument with his people that these planets and these idols have no effect on you whatsoever. We presume we are in touch with it, but in reality, we're only in touch with images of ourselves. An idol is of our own creation. An idol is our own pride, arrogance, ignorance, injustice, projected into something that becomes our ultimate concern around which our whole life revolves. To put it more accurately, in psychological terms, we are in touch with ourselves in alienated forms. And this is why it's such a grave injustice. One of the reasons why it's such a grave injustice. It's a very brilliant and remarkable psychological analysis and spiritual analysis of idolatry here, because it shows how ultimately the idol has no reality, so it's an illusion, but it's an illusion that we create and we imbue with a certain reality, and we see ourselves in it, as it were. It's our own product, and we possess it, and by possessing it, it possesses us. And so we end up in this remarkable situation where if the call to idolatry here, which is a call to slavery really, or slavery because it's a submission to ourselves, it's a submission to ignorance, it's a submission to our own ego projected on a grand scale, then if the call to idolatry is slavery, the call to Iman is the call to freedom. And that really turns our modern world on its head, because what is freedom? We often define freedom as the desire or the ability to do whatever we want to do. Then the question becomes, what is it that we want to do? Are we in control or sufficiently aware of what it is that we really need and we really want? Or is our want really defined these days by the consumerist culture around us and the materialism around us? If we really think about it, it's very difficult in our day and age to say that I have had a real clear rational choice in the many things that I desire and want in this world. Ultimately, we're a product of our environment, even more so in an environment like ours, modern world, where the whole field of marketing, or I call it the science of waswas, plays on your most base desires to inculcate in you a certain set of desires and wants, or even needs, artificial and arbitrary needs, that are not essential to what we are. What is essential to what we are? Don't ask me, don't ask the modern world, don't ask anyone. Look to the only objective reality. The one who has constituted our very being has mapped out what it is that we need to do to live the most authentic life. And so to live a free life, to live the most authentic life, is to live the one life that aligns most with the order of things. And the order of things, the hikmah of things, is what unfolds before us in the Qur'an and teaching of the Prophet ﷺ. So in the next verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, what is اعتزلتموهم وما يعبدون اعتزلتموهم وما يعبدون إلا الله فأووا إلى الكهف ينشر لكم ربكم من رحمته ويهيئ لكم من أمركم مرفقا. So the translation reads, and the youth said to one another, and when you have withdrawn from them and that which they worship other than God, retreat to the cave. Your Lord will spread out for you of His mercy and will prepare for you from your affair facility, mirfaqa. Well, اعتزلتموهم is a very interesting verb. It means to withdraw, but also not just to withdraw. اعتزال also means to completely, radically separate yourself, both physically from something and psychologically and spiritually. And so they withdrew from falsehood first, and then from the people of falsehood second. And that's followed after in the verse immediately where it says, اعتزلتموهم وما يعبدون. So you just withdrew from them and from that which they worship. And I'tizal here, withdrawal, begins with an inner disposition of withdrawal that translates into an outer withdrawal from all the signs and manifestations of what is false. And then, because ultimately these two ways of life are irreconcilable. The life that they're leaving behind in the city, that is overrun by the rule of tyranny, and also overrun by unbelief, because at the time, it is said at the time that these youth sought refuge in the cave, they were living in an age of disbelief, or at least disbelief in the kind of belief that they had. And so they had to make a really profound existential choice, which is, do we live amongst them? Because in one of the last verses in this chapter, they say to themselves, come back straight to the cave, so that they, and make sure no one discovers you, so that they don't return you back to their religion or their way of life. And so it seems that they had to withdraw both physically and psychologically and spiritually from the world that they lived in, because it left them no choice. It was so, the hegemony of this way of life was so overwhelming and everywhere, that the only way they could protect their faith is to leave, separate. And it says a lot about the kind of world that we live in today. Although they had to withdraw from society into the cave, that's not necessarily the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Then it's not necessarily the sunnah of Muslims. So the lesson here perhaps is not an entire or complete withdrawal from the world that we live in, but rather temporary withdrawals. The Prophet ﷺ used to withdraw into the cave once a year, several times a year, sometimes for a month, sometimes for a week, sometimes for longer. But ultimately he would come back after the khalwa wa jilwa. He would come back always from his retreat back into society in order to effect positive change. So they withdrew from them and what they worship other than God. So if we were to really draw up a table, it would look something like this. These are two worlds, two realities. There's the reality of Iman, which is light, really. Iman is light. And kufr is darkness. Disbelief or unbelief is darkness. Iman is justice. Kufr is injustice. Iman is truth. Kufr is falsehood. Iman is freedom. Kufr is slavery. Iman is happiness. Kufr is misery. And each one of these can really be turned into a whole presentation. I've already given a very brief, quick comment on the notion of freedom and contrasting it with the notion of slavery. Iman is aligning oneself with what is, and therefore, and it is an invitation to exercise our highest form of freedom, as opposed to kufr, which is turning us into slaves of our own ego and forcing us to submit to darkness or submit to idols that we have created. And it's really slavery. It's also falsehood. And therefore, in Iman resides true happiness. And in kufr lies misery, which doesn't necessarily suggest that in disbelief or living a life of disbelief, there isn't a certain measure of degree of happiness. But there are degrees of happiness, and certain kinds of happiness are ephemeral. The happiness of the flesh and the body, the happiness of this world dies with this world. The happiness of Iman continues with us into the next life. It's a happiness that penetrates beyond the physical world into the beyond. And so it's more real, it's more enduring. Anyone who's ever tasted the lezzah, the joy, the pleasure of loving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his Prophet sallallahu knows that this kind of pleasure is more real and more intense than any kind of physical pleasure or any kind of worldly pleasure. So it's a very, very important point to bear in mind. Again, perhaps next time we can come back to more of these themes. So I want to comment now on the verbs, وَاعْتَزَلْتُمُوهُمْ فَأْوُوا. Because in the translations, it often suggests that اعتزلتموهم, God is saying, وَاعْتَزَلْتُمُوهُمْ وَمَا يَعْبُدُونَ فَأْوُوا إِلَى الْكَهْفِ. Or it sometimes says that it's they're talking to each other. So who's saying what here? Is it that they are saying to one another, when you have withdrawn from that which they worship, seek refuge in the cave? Or is it in fact, God says to them, when you have withdrawn from that which they worship, seek refuge in the cave? And if so, it really kind of complicates the whole discourse, because it really makes us think, well, who's saying what and who's doing what? Did God tell them to do so? How? If so, how? Did He inspire them? Did He speak to them? The Quran never really explains in this particular context. It leaves this thread deliberately pregnant with possibilities and meanings. Is God implanting an idea into them? Did He speak to them? Or is the word fa'wu, this communication from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God is reciting, telling us that He said to them fa'wu, but it may not have been a direct fa'wu, seek refuge. The way in which Allah communicates is multiple. And so this fa'wu is pregnant with possibilities. In the Quran, we come across the term wahi on several occasions. Just to give you an example, we understand the word wahi as referring to revelation with a capital R, i.e. the scriptures. But in several other instances in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses the word revelation with a small r, in the sense of revealing some wisdom to people, or as a form of inspiration. So for example, when He says to أوحينا إلى النحل, that He inspired the bees to build their homes in the mountains, or that He inspired the mother of Moses, وأوحينا إلى أم موسى, or when He inspired to put her son in the river, in a basket in the river, or when He inspired her to spy on him from behind a tree after the wife of Pharaoh had taken Moses into her household. There are several occasions in which the word wahi is used to refer to a certain kind of communication from God to His creation, whether it's birds or animals, bees or humans. And وَأَوْحَى فِي كُلِّ سَمَاءٍ أَمْرَهَا, also He says, where He inspired in every heaven its amr, its command. And the form in which this inspiration happens is a mystery. One possible way in which it happens to humans is in the following manner, and I'm really illustrating it on a graph here to make it clearer. But if we were to take this diagram here as representing our outer world and inner world, in our outer world there is actions. Our inner world consists of really very interesting, complex flow of consciousness. When we want to act on something, we often it starts with a prompting, a khatir. So that's why I've illustrated it here with a very faint gray color. A prompting is an incoming thought or a prod, a passing idea or thought, but it's a faint one. It comes quickly and leaves, but if it comes, we sometimes dwell on it. Now it has four sources. Al-Khatir has four sources according to the Islamic tradition. It could be from God as a communication. It could be from angels as some kind of nodding or prodding in the right direction. It could be from our nafs, our psychic realm, especially our lower nafs, or it could be from shaitan. So there's four sources of the prompting, as it were. It could be a communication from God directly. And so if we dwell on this prompting, you wake up in the morning and all of a sudden you'll have this thought to do pleasure, subhanAllah. You weren't thinking about it at all, but the time came, you woke up in the middle of the night and you had this thought to have pray Fajr. You look at your clock, it's almost Fajr time, subhanAllah. So it could be in this form. And if you dwell on it a little bit more and you think, okay, yeah, it becomes an irada, a will, and then it becomes a determination, and then it becomes a qasd, an objective that you want to achieve. Then it becomes a niyyah, and a niyyah is really a culmination of a prompting at the moment that you're poised to act. And so the scholars say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala really inspires us here, and here He strengthens our will and He strengthens our heart. Earlier we said, وَرَبَطْنَا عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ, Right? At every one of these stages, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala assists us and communicates with us. And so this kind of fa'u, which is articulated here as a verb, may not be that he said literally, they heard a voice saying fa'u. It may have been that he communicated to them or inspired them with the thought or the idea of seeking refuge in the cave. And what this really reveals is something quite fascinating and interesting. If as modern psychology suggests that we are a result of a lot of unconscious promptings and inclinations, then the logical question would be, would I not want to be aligning myself with reality such that most of my promptings and inner inclinations are coming from Allah, al-Haq, or would I want to be at the mercy of shaitan's promptings and my psychological promptings? If you really think about it, if you pause to really think about the fact that as psychological entities, as human beings, as creatures, something that psychoanalysis has shown to be the case, although its understanding of the human psyche is problematic. But one thing I think it has done that is positive is it has shown the modern world that indeed we are not really rational creatures, but beneath the surface of rational consciousness are all these lurking, hidden, dark desires. And so that's why many psychoanalysts conclude that we are a result of nothing but our sexual drive and our and other drives. But what psychoanalysis misses is that the inclinations we have within us, their source is not only from below, from the nafs and the shaitan. It can also be from above, from the angel and malak, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's our saving grace, really. Psychoanalysis seems to have cut us off from what is above. But as Muslims, we know that in alam al-ghayb, there are threads connecting to us from Allah, for everything and everywhere. And so wouldn't we want to align ourselves such that we are protected from the wrong kind of promptings and align with the right kind of promptings? Wouldn't that be the logical, sane thing to do? And given the fact that we are at the mercy of promptings, let's make them the good kind of promptings. And what this verse really also points out, fa'u ila al-kahfi, it points out that something quite interesting about human agency. Are we really truly the agents of our actions? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to the Prophet ﷺ in one of his battles, وَمَا رَمَيْتَ إِذْ رَمَيْتَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ رَمَى. It's not you who struck the arrow, but it is God who struck the arrow. And what that's suggesting is that to a certain extent, we are not always the only agents of every act we perform. We are co-agents, as it were, of our own acts. And therefore, this complex model of reality, as it were, shows us that if that is the case, then we really better hurry up to make sure that we are co-agents of the right kind of actions with the right kind of direction. I'm going on a tangent here. I will stop and continue to the next point because we really have to finish the rest of the surah, inshallah. And so when you have withdrawn from them and what they worship, فَأْوَذَا الْكَهْفِ يَنْشُرُ لَكُمْ رَبُّكُمْ مِنْ رَحْمَتِهِ وَيُهَيِّئْ لَكُمْ مِنْ أَمْرِكُمْ مِرْفَقًا. So God will spread out his compassion for you. And I love this image. This is a Muqarnas dome in the Al-Hamra. And the Muqarnas dome in the Islamic tradition is often used as an image of divine creation as God spreads his compassion and creates the world. I find it a very pulsating image of compassion, of spreading. And the word in Arabic for spreading is yanshur. And so I mentioned this last time, the constricted space of the cave now is expanded by the warmth of faith. And the cave, which is a womb, really symbolic of a womb, also symbolizes with a womb, rahim, is joined to its functional root, rahmah. In that sense, it becomes an extension, an ontological extension of divine Rahmah. It, like a womb, is life nurturing. There is no death here. There is only life in its true meaning. They may have come to the cave, but to an external observer, they have been put to death, or a deep sleep, which is equivalent to death. But in reality, they were being put to life. And this is one of the profound symbols of the people of the cave, is that for most people, death at the end of our life seems to be the end. But in fact, we die only to live eternally in the real life, al-akhirah. And likewise here, for all intents and purposes, to an external observer, they have gone into a deep slumber or symbolic death. But in fact, they have gone into the real kind of life, as we'll show in a minute. And so the connotations here of yanshur, nashara, also include to revive or to resurrect. You know, the akhirah is called yawm and nashr or nushur. And in the dua, when we wake up in the morning, after we wake up after a long sleep, we say, Alhamdulillah li ahyana ba'dama amatana wa ilayhi nushur. To whom we shall be resurrected or revived. And so this notion of yanshur lakum rabbukum min rahmatihi is already suggesting that he will spread his mercy upon you, because you're going to go into a sleep in which there is your revival, your real, and so they live. There is a sense in which they live with God or life with God. I called it last time, we refer to it as maqa ma'allah, which is how it's referred to in the spiritual traditions. And so we move on now to this death. And وَتَرَى الشَّمْسَ, I'm going to have to move a little bit faster now. وَتَرَى الشَّمْسَ إِذَا طَلَعَتْ تَزَاوَرُ عَنْ كَهْفِهِمْ ذَاتَ الْيَمِينِ وَإِذَا غَرَبَتْ تُقْرِضُهُمْ ذَاتَ الشِّمَالِ وَهُمْ فِي فَجْوَةٍ مِّنْهُ ذَلِكَ مِنْ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ مَنْ يَهْدِ اللَّهُ فَهُوَ الْمُهْتَدِي وَمَنْ يُضْلِلْ فَلَنْ تَجِدَ لَهُ وَلِيًّا مُرْشِدًا. Okay, so here we must recall verse 11 that has already told us that they went to sleep. In verse 16, the previous verse has already told us that they were inspired by God to take refuge in the cave. This verse really, we stand back, as it were, as spectators now, presented with a remarkable, vivid, powerful image of tossing and turning in the cave. Imagine a time-lapse video of 300 years where they're tossing and turning, tossing and turning, tossing and turning, and the sun is the sun's rays are moving across the floor of the cave, as it were, never touching them really, because there's a gap between them, and their shadows almost playing or dancing on the cave walls. It's a very powerful, moving image, really, time-lapse image, especially if you read it in Arabic. And again, we come across this ذَلِكَ مِنْ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ, you know, this remarkable image to us. So we are the spectators of this image. The divine clap of thunder comes in and says, this is not really a big deal for me. ذَلِكَ مِنْ آيَاتِ اللَّهِ. It's one of the many signs. And it reconnects us to verse 9, that this is one among the many signs of God. وَتَحْسَبُهُمْ أَيْقَاظًا وَهُمْ رُقُودٌ. That you think them awake, but they're actually asleep. وَنُقَلِّبُهُمْ ذَاتَ الْيَمِينِ وَذَاتَ الشِّمَالِ. We toss and turn them right and left. وَكَلْبُهُمْ بَاسِطٌ ذِرَاعَيْهِ بِالْوَصِيدِ. So the dog is outstretched, 4 arms at the entrance. لو اطلعت عليهم لوليت منهم فرارا ولا ملئت منهم رعبا. وتحسبهم, again, for all appearances they look alive, their eyes are open, their hair has not grown, they do not age, they are still breathing. They're neither dead nor alive, nor asleep nor awake. And if you were to look upon them, and I think many of the commentators point out that this is in reference to both the Prophet ﷺ and to us. لو اطلعت عليهم. So here, you know, the divine is talking to us. You think they're awake while they're lying there. We turn them and toss them and turn them. And then if you look upon them, you would flee in terror. One flees from them because one's sense of reality is really distorted. You're looking at people who seem to be dead, but they're breathing. They seem to be sleeping, but their eyes are awake. They're not aging. Time has stood still. Right? So in the previous image that we saw, we're supposed to have really be shocked by what we've seen. And some of the commentators also point out that if you look upon them and see the traces of our power and care of them, you would flee from them. You would not bear to stand and gaze upon the traces of our majesty. Your fleeing from them would then be really a fleeing from us, or what you see of us upon them. So what the commentators are pointing out here is that we have cloaked them, or we have covered them with a majesty. And when you look upon them, you would flee because of that. Because he's covered them with that kind of that majesty. We removed from them the attribute of humanness, bashariya, and annihilated them in the attributes of holiness, qudsiyya. And so qudsiyya is something that we can't really gaze upon directly without being filled with a sense of haiba and awe in that presence. And so, because they are alive with Allah, and only God knows what they've been doing, what they're doing in that other world in which they are alive with Allah. But the traces of that life that they're living with Allah is projected into alam al-shahada, our world, as an aura of holiness, and that's what we flee from. It's not necessarily just a terror. I mean, there are multiple interpretations of this. That when you look upon them, they're alive but they're breathing, and their eyes are awake but they're sleeping. It seems terrifying. But also there's another way of reading it, which is what I've just explained here. And then they're resurrected. وَكَذَلِكَ بَعَثْنَاهُمْ لِيَتَسَاءَلُوا بَيْنَهُمْ قَالَ قَائِلٌ مِّنْهُمْ كَمَ لَبِثْتُمْ قَالُوا لَبِثْنَا يَوْمًا أَوْ بَعْضَ يَوْمٍ قَالُوا رَبُّكُمْ أَعْلَمُ بِمَا لَبِثْتُمْ فَبَعَثُوا أَحَدَكُمْ بِوَرِقِهِمْ هَٰذِهِ إِلَى الْمَدِينَةِ فَلْيَنظُرْ أَيُّهَا أَزْكَىٰ طَعَامًا فَلْيَأْتِكُمْ بِرِزْقٍ مِّنْهُ وَلْيَتَلَطَّفْ وَلَا يُشْعَرَنَّ بِكُمْ أَحَدًا. Very interesting description here of Yawman or Ba'da Yawm, because in many parts of the Qur'an we read verses in which on the Day of Judgment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks the criminals, those who disbelieved, how long did you tarry in this world? And they would say, مَا لَبِثُوا غَيْرَ سَاعَةٍ, or Yawman or Ba'da Yawm. This reference to the distortion of time is quite interesting, because in this particular instance here, suddenly the scene fast forwards to the resurrection. We don't know how much time has passed by, although later on in the verse we'll realize it's 309 years. All of a sudden they're awake. They are confused. They're disoriented. How much time have they slept? They turn to each other in confusion. They were in another world, and so they're now back in this world. And in that sense, time then has this kind of eerie, otherworldly quality to it. It's suspended, it's distorted. And when the Prophet ﷺ returned from his night journey, sorry, there's a few typos in this presentation. When he returned from his night journey, his bed was still warm. So can you imagine the different relationship of time between these different worlds? These Ashab al-Kahf enter into another world. They're living with God. He greets them, and they wake up. There's no observable changes, and so as far as they're concerned, they look upon each other and they realize, well, they don't look different. So no matter how much time they feel like they may have spent with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's obvious from their physical appearance that, well, at least in the physical world that they step back into, not much time has passed. It also may refer to how much time they've spent in the other dimension. I want to explain something here quite quickly. It's an important point that I mentioned at the beginning, in the introduction to this session, but I didn't have time to really get into in great detail. The different dimensions of time. I pointed out last time that this is the divine realm here, as it were, and at the threshold of the created world, this is the world of creation, from the spiritual realm down. At the threshold of this world is time and space. So time and space are created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here there's no sense of, there's no time at all, really. Time begins in the created world with us. But even in this spectrum of spiritual realm to this physical realm down here, there are different notions of time and different dimensions of time. They're not equal. So if we take the human realm, which includes, because the human beings straddle both the physical world and the spiritual world, we have a body and a soul and spirit. This is our domain here. And so if we look at divine time or a divine day as a moment, so when we talk about, as I said earlier, the 7 days of creation or the 6 days of creation mentioned in the Qur'an refer in the divine realm to moments that are simultaneous. In the spiritual realm, they unfold, and then in our physical world, they unfold as the 7 days of our human realm. And so we come across a lot of references in the Qur'an in which the Malaika come down to earth and they rise back up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in days that seem like equivalent to 1,000 of our days, or 50,000 of our days. And so what that means is that in the spiritual realm, time is not equivalent to our time in the physical world. Right? The further we move up from the physical world, experience of time changes and differs. And so in the human realm, in the physical world, we experience what was often referred to in the Islamic tradition as outer time, zaman afaqi. It's the kind of time most of us are used to. We use it to calculate, measure the days of the week and the hours and the months, etc. But we also, as human beings, are able to experience an inner time, zaman anfusi. And you'll notice that the zaman anfusi is across the threshold of our physical world. So we're able to, within us, experience a different dimension of time because of our spiritual nature. And so this is the realm in which Ahl al-Kahf have entered into. When they went to sleep, they entered into Alam al-Ruh. This is the realm in which visions happen. This is the world in which angels exist. This is the realm in which one encounters ru'ya and other worldly realities. This is the world in which the Mi'raj happened also, of the Prophet ﷺ. It's not the physical world, and it's not the divine world, because only the divine realm belongs to the divine. It's this intermediary realm here, in between. And so that's very important to bear in mind, because what the Surah Al-Kahf is doing, and what the Qur'an does a lot of, really, it's constantly alternating between perspectives from this world, this world, this world, this world, this world, this world. And you really have to try to catch up with the perspectives to understand what's going on. Most of us, when we narrate a story along a vector of time, which is physical time. So a linear unfolding of events. But sometimes linear events unfolding along this vector here in this physical world may have influences from above, right? So it's important to bear that in mind. Okay, so moving on. كذلك بعثناهم ليتساءلوا بينهم قال قائل منهم كم لبثتم قالوا لبثنا يوما أو بعض يوم. Right? I found a wonderful description or commentary on the Yawman or Ba'da Yawm. The time spent with the beloved is short, no matter how long it lasts. The lover never gets enough of the beloved, even if he spends an eon. The end of his yearning is like its beginning. There's also this notion that time spent with the beloved is always too short. So when they were resurrected, although it may have been a very long time they spent in the divine with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or in that spiritual realm, it may have felt like just a day or part of a day. Those asleep have no awareness of time. And the verse goes on, إِنَّهُمْ إِنْ يَظْهَرُوا عَلَيْكُمْ يَرْجُمُوكُمْ أَوْ يُعِيدُوكُمْ فِي مِلَّتِهِمْ وَلَنْ تُفْلِحُوا إِذًا أَبَدًا. So they say to one another, in the previous verse it is said, go to the city and use your coins, your silver coins, and bring us back some food, and make sure no one notices your presence. Because if they do see you, يَرْجُمُوكُمْ, they will soon stone you or return you to their religion. So this suggests that when they first fled, that they indeed fled because of the hegemony of kufr, and there was no way of avoiding it or retaining their faith, because if they had stayed among them in the city, they would have forced them back into their religion. In the next verse we read, وَكَذَلِكَ أَعْثَرْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ لِيَعْلَمُوا أَنَّ وَعْدَ اللَّهِ حَقٌّ. And similarly, we caused them to be found, that they would know that the promise of Allah is truth, and that of the hour is in no doubt. أَنَّ وَعْدَ اللَّهِ حَقٌّ وَأَنَّ السَّاعَةَ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهَا إِذْ يَتَنَازَعُونَ بَيْنَهُمْ أَمْرَهُمْ فَقَالُوا ابْنُوا عَلَيْهِمْ بُنْيَانًا رَبُّهُمْ أَعْلَمُ بِهِمْ قَالَ الَّذِينَ غَلَبُوا عَلَى أَمْرِهِمْ لَنَتَّخِذَنَّ عَلَيْهِمْ مَسْجِدًا. So we can't have a detailed commentary on this, but basically Allah Ta'ala is saying that He made their cave, He made it possible for someone to discover it. And in some of the traditions, it is suggested that a shepherd who went to a cave managed to knock down one of its walls and discovered a cave and discovered them in it. And this is at a time in which a few hundred years has gone by, and the inhabitants of the city had now become believers. But it was also an age in which people were actually doubting resurrection, the resurrection of bodies. And the doubt concerning the resurrection of bodies is something that comes up again and again in many traditions. Alhamdulillah, it's not something that comes up prominently in the Islamic tradition, but in many other traditions. So Quraysh did not believe Muhammad ﷺ when he told them about the resurrection. They found that just impossible, too difficult to conceive how God would gather the bodies again and resurrect them. And so at that particular moment in which the inhabitants of the town, although they had become Christian, were disputing over the reality of resurrection. And they already had known that several hundred years earlier, these youth disappeared and were never found. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made these youth discovered. And so in the meantime, people had been debating their centuries. The story is by now a khabar mutawatir. It's an important point, because someone might say, well, how did they know that these youth had gone into the cave? By that time, so many people had recounted the story that it had become an authoritative narration. Khabar mutawatir, it's repeated by several different people, several different traditions, that it was a fact that these individuals had fled, sought refuge in a cave, and disappeared. Right? It's a very important point to bear in mind. And so, لِيَعْلَمُوا here is concerning not the believers, but those who disbelieved in it. So God made the cave discovered, or He allowed it to be discovered, so that those who disbelieve in the resurrection would have proof of the resurrection, right? Because they had known about these individuals who had fled to the cave, and they had known about it through narrations from several different sources, such that it become mutawatir, it become authentic. So they couldn't doubt the story. They couldn't look upon these individuals who were sleeping in the cave and say, oh, this is a hoax, or this is made up, because they know for a fact that these individuals had disappeared a few hundred years earlier. And then they disputed among themselves. Some said, let's build a building on them. But those who eventually prevailed argued that they should build almost like a shrine or a mosque. It's called a mosque here, a masjid. It doesn't necessarily mean a place of worship, but a place of veneration. They had identified this place as a place in which a divine tajalli, a miracle, had happened, and they wanted to honor it. Now, I don't have time to get into too much detail here, but I do want to mention, I'm going to freeze on this slide here so that those of you at home can pause this slide at some point and read it later. But I found that interesting discussion in a book on the Creed of Islam by Sheikh al-Azhar Abdul Halim Mahmoud, with a foreword by Martin Links and translated by Dr. Mahmoud Abdul Halim. That a very interesting discussion on the proofs of resurrection in the Islamic tradition. Because someone asked me, that okay, this incident in the Quran is proof to those who witnessed it that the resurrection is real. It's true. But for me, as someone in the 21st century, I'm reading a story about people from the past. My response was twofold, really. One was a Muslim who believes in the veracity and authority of the Quran must believe that this event actually happened. And that's proof enough that the resurrection is possible. In addition to actually it being a very important pillar of our faith. But also, there are remarkable Quranic arguments that prove it. And I found this page, these 2 pages here, and the discussion in them quite beneficial to those who want to read the pages. In a later page, the Sheikh Halim Mahmoud mentioned something quite interesting. He says, our bodies, from every few days or every few weeks, our bodies regenerate and renew themselves. And so our body never is the same body from moment to moment, or from every few days or every few weeks. So our body regenerates, and so it's never really the same body. And so we have the same body, but not the same body. It's constantly regenerated. Isn't this a form of constant resurrection? And it's a very interesting point. If you read some of the points made here by Al-Kindi, one of the great early Muslim philosophers, and his arguments based on the Quranic verses, it's quite remarkable that there is sufficient rational proof that at least resurrection is not something impossible. It's not something irrational. People often think that resurrection is something that we have to believe in, and that is true. But people often then falsely conclude that there is no sufficient evidence, or that it's something so impossible. But in actual fact, it isn't. If we look around about us in the world, especially in our day and age, in the age of quarks and quantum theory and remarkable discoveries in science, where scientists are believing things even more unbelievable than something like the resurrection, which seems a lot more rational and commonsensical than the idea of multiverse, or the idea that somehow beyond the Big Bang there was, they speculate about what existed beyond the Big Bang, etc. So a lot of these things seem, a lot of the tenets of our faith seem a lot more reasonable than a lot of this speculation. Only God knows. So the verses continue to the end, and I'm going to comment verbally. I haven't committed anything to writing. I knew this presentation would go on for too long. سيقولون ثلاثة رابعهم كلبهم. So here they're speculating about the number of them in the cave. ويقولون خمسة سادسهم كلبهم رجما بالغيب. ويقولون سبعة وثامنهم كلبهم قل ربي أعلم بعدتهم ما يعلمهم إلا قليل فلا تماري فيهم إلا مراء ظاهرا ولا تستفت فيهم منهم أحدا. So they will say that there were 3, with the 4th being the dog, 5, the 6th being the dog, but they are really guessing at the unseen. They will say 7, and the 8th is the dog. Now, some of the scholars say that if you read the verse carefully, ثلاثة رابعهم كلبهم خمسة سادسهم كلبهم رجما بالغيب. So, in reference to that these numbers mentioned before are actually false. They're guessing at the unseen. ويقولون سبعة وثامنهم كلبهم. There's a wow there. قل ربي أعلم بعدتهم. So some scholars suggest that the real number here is 7, and 8 is the dog, because it came after رجما بالغيب, guessing at the unseen. الله أعلم, of course, بعدتهم, and the number is irrelevant really, because the haqq, the truth, the reality that the Quran is trying to mention here in this verse is not to confirm the number that the Jewish scholars in Medina, Yathrib, had. It's not here to entertain their curiosity or their mind games. So it's not really giving the number here. And it's actually addressing the fundamental problem, spiritual disease, that the Yathrib scholars and the Quraysh asked the Prophet. The real question wasn't وَمَا الرُّوحُ. because they don't know what ruh is. The real question wasn't what happened to these individuals, because they don't know exactly what happened to these individuals, even though the Quran provides them with details that they could not possibly known about. For example, the Quran provides them with details about what they said to each other in the cave. It provides them with details about, it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who directly inspired them to go to the cave. It provides them with a lot of details about how they tossed and turned in the cave. No one could have possibly seen that. It is the divine gaze. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does give them a lot of details in the cave they would not have possibly known about. And so they couldn't verify it with their stories. They couldn't say, oh, these details God provided us with, oh, they tally well with the story, the version of the story that we have, because they could not have possibly known these details. So instead of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responding to them by confirming to them what they already know, He responded to them by telling them things they couldn't possibly know. And He also didn't respond to them directly by answering their question, but He answered their condition. And that is, they are pretenders to truth and knowledge. They don't know anything about ghaib. They couldn't possibly know anything about the reality of how these events are unfolded. And so the real answer to them, قُلْ رَبِّي أَعْلَمُ بِعِدَّتِهِمْ. You ignorant scholars who are testing the Prophet, you know nothing. Bow before the all-knowing. That's the only a message a spiritual disease like arrogance and ignorance can have. They had enough miracles to believe in the Prophet ﷺ. And the Quranic verse continues, وَلَا تَقُولَنَّ لِشَيْءٍ إِنِّي فَاعِلٌ ذَلِكَ غَدًا إِلَّا أَنْ يَشَاءَ اللَّهُ وَاذْكُرْ رَبَّكَ إِذَا نَسِيتَ وَقُلْ عَسَىٰ أَنْ يَهْدِيَنِ رَبِّي لِأَقْرَبَ مِنْ هَذَا رَشَدًا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also guiding us here and giving us a dua. What do we say? We have to say, because we know nothing of the ghaib, we say, Insha'Allah. And this is partly also in response to the Prophet ﷺ. When he was asked these questions, he said, I'll give you the answer tomorrow. And he forgot to say Insha'Allah. And so he says a mu'ataba. This is the divine educating of ta'deeb of the Prophet ﷺ, that you should say Insha'Allah. But it's a ta'deeb to us directly. That's why it's not addressed directly to the Prophet. It doesn't say, Ya Muhammad, la taqulanna shay'an li shay'in inni fa'alun dhalika. But rather it says, you, whoever you may be, لا تقولن لشيء فعل ذلك غدا. And then what is it that you're supposed to say? إلا أن يشاء الله. إلا أن يشاء الله. Okay. And the truth of the matter is, ولبثوا في كهفهم 300 سنين وازدادوا 9. Scholars interpret this as being a reference to 300 solar years or 309 lunar years, because the lunar year is usually shorter than the solar year. Again, even that detail is irrelevant. This is a very important point. I want to end this presentation on this verse. It's the last verse of this story, but it's also a very, very crucial one. So, بِمَا لَبِثُوا. It's often translated as God knows how long they tarried. But it's actually more profound than that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't say, قُلْ اللَّهُ أَعْلَمْ كَمْ لَبِثُوا, or directly references time here. He says, قُلْ اللَّهُ أَعْلَمُ بِمَا لَبِثُوا. It carries a meaning which is even deeper, which is, say Allah knows or knows more concerning their tarrying, because basically it's the ultimate response to the questions to the Prophet ﷺ. God knows concerning their affair or their state. God knows more how long they tarried, what their condition was, what was unfolding in the events, the links between the unseen and the seen. To Him belong السماوات والأرض, غيب السماوات والأرض. He is the one who knows the unseen. So basically, God is the one who knows the complex reality of events, the human events, as they unfold in the world. أبصر به وأسمع. This is a form of exaggeration, and it's an interesting expression. It says, the translation, it says, how seeing is he and how hearing, which is an odd translation. It literally translates as see by him and hear by him, which is another way of saying he's the only one who sees, the all-seeing. He's the only one who hears, the all-hearing. And so how magnificent is his seeing and his hearing compared to ours? Therefore, see by him and hear by him. And you see by him and you hear by him by the fact that he recites to you Ahsan al-Qasas. ما لهم من دونه من ولي ولا يشرك في حكمه أحدا. Okay, we can go on for another tangent for the end of this verse, inshallah, but I won't do that right now. I'm going to leave it at that. It's been an hour and a half already. Inshallah, I'll try to we'll go to Q&A, inshallah, and let me see the questions. Why the Quran? Okay, so Jane Caswit, why the Quran concerned about the detail? What do you mean? I apologize if some parts are confusing. That's a fault on my behalf. I do apologize. There is more to what happened in the cave than we can know, of course. That's why we always attribute what happened in the cave to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Why today there are no miracles to prove resurrection? Human doubt is still present. Would be great to share the question with okay. Well, concerning the miracles, I mean, the miracles are everywhere, really. If we're after miracles, the kind of miracles that are mentioned in the Quran, these specific kinds of miracles, they came as proof for particular moments or particular incidents in history. But reality of the Quran is that it's constantly pointing to miracles happening all around us. And the lives of the awliya, I mean, the Ahl al-Kahf were awliya. The fact that we know about these miracles is because God tells us about them. It doesn't mean that miracles aren't happening today. They're happening all the time with all sorts of different people. So they haven't ceased. And those who have come into or encounters many of the awliya of our age come across very similar types of miracles. Not, of course, sleeping for 309 years, but miracles that define any straightforward, logical, rational understanding of things. And the question of miracles is an interesting one, because if the question for a miracle is to offer proof that something is real, there is sufficient proof of it without the miracle or need for a miracle. And the pages I gave you are arguments in favor of proving resurrection. But for me, subhanAllah, for myself, the proof of resurrection is the fact that I get up every morning. You might say, well, that's a very silly observation. It's so commonsensical. It happens to everyone. It does. But if one understands the reality of what sleep actually is, it's a miracle we actually get up in the morning and wake up, which is why the Prophet ﷺ called upon us to call upon Allah with a dua. Alhamdulillah, ahyana ba'da ma amatana wa ilayhi an-nushur. It's not a metaphorical expression. We literally did. I mean, if you think about it, when you go to sleep, we enter into, I'm not talking about the analysis of sleep from the perspective of neuroscience or psychology. I'm talking about analysis of sleep from the perspective of the Islamic tradition. When we enter into sleep, of course, we enter into a world that is remarkable and quite profound. We enter into a world in which we are beyond this physical world. It's almost as if, and if you actually analyze the reality of sleep, there are things that happen in sleep and dreams that can't be explained by sometimes common sense or rational understanding. Which is why dreams were so much of a point of contention for Freud, who couldn't really come to terms with them, and why they were such a remarkable thing for someone like Carl Jung, psychologist of the 20th century, who understood sleep much better than Freud, but he also understood the reality that sleep suggests to us dimensions to time and space and reality that are beyond the physical. And the fact that when we sleep and we're able to see or have visions of things that are yet to come or haven't happened yet, or experience things that have been gone for hundreds of years or thousands of years, or it's quite remarkable. The Prophet ﷺ used to say that sleep is a portion of prophecy. So after his death, the only power of prophecy that remains with regular human beings is ru'ya haqq, which is the capacity of the heart to penetrate beyond the physical veils of reality into the unseen. They're proof enough of the fact that the unseen is real. Imam Ghazali used to say that the greatest proof of prophecy is the fact that we dream. It's not the place to get into that, but the reality of dreams is remarkable, and it hasn't yet been explained. Okay, I'm going to consult my phone to see all the other questions, inshallah. And I promise, if there are if I don't answer or able to look at all the questions here, I'll write them down, inshallah, and get to them next week. To the question of contemplation and time, I'll inshallah try to address that next week. It's a very important one. Killing the child for Hadrat Khidr, inshallah we'll do that next week, because we're going to address that next week, Musa and Khidr. So please reserve those questions for that session, inshallah. Okay, a lot of the questions seems to be about Musa and Khidr. On psychedelics, many have had profound insight about themselves and the universe, which for some reason have transformed them. Once again, I don't want to get into an extended conversation on psychedelics. I thought I made myself quite clear with the model, but I didn't say that people don't have profound experiences. They do. What I said was psychedelics cannot produce spiritual experiences from alam al-ruh. And I pointed out that we have to be quite precise with our use of terminology. Yes, psychological experiences can be very profound, and they can yield insights about the universe and transform people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're from alam al-ruh, and therefore we can't really call them spiritual. And it doesn't mean that they're of the highest type of experiences. All sorts of people can have psychological experiences, very profound ones about anything in this world. The problem I have with people who confuse psychological experiences with spiritual ones, and a lot of my friends do that, is that they end up then insisting on that their experience is the most remarkable thing, and therefore it is truly a spiritual experience, and therefore it gets them on an ego trip, suggesting to themselves that they have somehow been gifted with a unique understanding or unique insight into the nature of reality, and therefore it seems to develop and inflate their egos. And a true spiritual experience doesn't do that. So that's what I'm not saying everyone who has an experience like that does that, but the distinction is important to guard ourselves against ourselves and against confusing one with the other. If we can achieve spiritual experiences by having a drug, psychedelics, then why spend years and years in the desert meditating? Just defeats the purpose. This is proof that these two kind of experiences are not the same at all. Psychic experience can be meaningful in its own psychic domain. The spiritual experience is meaningful in its more higher domain. Okay, all right. We'll leave it at that, inshallah. And inshallah, I'll go through the rest of the questions, write them down, and try to answer them next week, inshallah. I'd like to thank you all for attending. The rival of Freud was Carl Jung, Carl C.G. Jung, J-U-N-G. And I mention him because he's a psychologist with profound insights into the human condition, but also he had a problematic understanding of the reality of the spiritual world. But is there any reference book relating to the Islamic psychological paradigm? There are many, maybe next week, inshallah, I'll provide a list on the first slide of that, inshallah. And one more question before I leave. Using the criterion you showed to distinguish genuine spiritual experience from pseudo-spiritual experiences, can two individuals reach different conclusions on a given spiritual experience? Yes, well, definitely. I mean, the thing about interpreting inner experiences, whether psychological or spiritual, is that it requires a mastery of self and profound knowledge of the inner world, the workings of the inner world. That's why in the spiritual tradition, like Tasawwuf, many insist that the presence of a murshid, a spiritual guide, is important. Simply because, I mean, the analogy with a tourist guide is really useful. If you had a mountaineer who's discovered every side of Everest as a guide climbing up the mountain, it's very different than if you attempt it yourself and then collapse or fall into a trap or slip off an edge in the first 100-meter climb. A guide is someone who's familiar with the terrain, and if you understand that the inner world is far greater in terms of its expanse than the outer world that we live in, and it is riddled with good things and bad things, and good influences and bad influences, and great regions and dark regions, and traps and psychological deceptions, etc., etc. It's a very complex terrain. That's why in many mythological traditions they portray the inner world as a terrain with pseudo-mythological creatures that stand in your way and bar your entrance into various regions, and you have to really pass all sorts of different labors and tests in order to penetrate into the spiritual world. They portray it in this way because it's a depiction, an imaginal depiction of the reality of this terrain. It's very difficult, and if someone's not familiar with a very treacherous terrain, you can't really distinguish between your psychic inclination and your shaitani inclination. You need a criteria, right? There are external criteria and internal criteria. The external criteria is if the shaitan tells you don't pray, you know that Shara says you must pray, and therefore you know that it's not from the higher realm, it's from shaitan or from your nafs, right? But then there are also internal criteria. Does the experience provide me with a higher level of consciousness? Does it increase my knowledge and understanding of God? Does it provide me with better, more ethical disposition towards things in the world? Does it provide me with a deeper understanding of how I'm supposed to treat others and God and treat creatures, etc., etc.? So there are internal criteria, external criteria. The external criteria are much easier to know because they're laid down in the Shara. The internal criteria are what the masters of the inner territories know, and they are that's what you find in the tradition of the purification of the soul, or the tradition of Tazkiyat an-Nafs, or what we call today Tasawwuf. Okay, all right, we'll leave it at that, inshallah, and I'll take up questions next week. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.